And welcome. As we near the end of 2024, we will start reading a lot or listening to a lot of year end wrap ups or reports. Since this is a presidential year, we will have those numbers and reports also. In 2024, campaign spending reached new heights with megadonors and corporate interests playing an increasingly dominant role in our elections. The wealthiest individuals and organizations poured unprecedented amounts of money into races, seeking greater influence and access to government. Now, the thought of that makes me angry, and I think it is so unfair. And while I don't want to put words in your mouth or thoughts in your head, you probably think the same thing too, that it's unfair. First, I'm going to offer some full transparency here. I've been on both sides of this, not to that extent, though. I'm Natalie Tennant, former West Virginia Secretary of State and newly elected part-time commissioner of Kanawha County, our state's largest county. And I'm a low-level donor to candidates when I can afford it. So how did we get here? And what can we do to make sure that our political system serves the interests of all Americans and not just the few with the deepest pockets? If you've been asking some of these same questions and more, then you're in the right place for this Brennan Center Live event. As many of you know, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy organization that works to repair, revitalize, and defend our systems of democracy and justice so they work for all Americans. The Brennan Center cannot support or oppose any candidate for office. We will offer you vigorous debates on the policies and positions that matter for our democracy. Civility is important to all of us, so those who post or rude or inappropriate language on our message stream on YouTube, you'll be removed from the conversation. And we also ask you to follow along the conversation on social media with the hashtag Brennan Center Live and use the live closed captioning if you need it. And today we have a good conversation coming up because we're hearing from Ciara Torres-Spelliscy, a law professor at Stetson University, a Brennan Center fellow, and the author of a new book, Corporatocracy: How to Protect Democracy from Dark Money and Corrupt Politicians. And her book explores how corporate greed has taken over politics, fueling scandals, corruption, and the rise of anti-democracy movement. So welcome, Professor Ciara, as your students call you, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's good to have you. And to the audience, just like the professor students, get ready to participate and ask your questions in the chat. Now, Ciara, thank you for writing this book and bringing it to light, the connections of corporate money to campaigns, the history with so many examples that you put in here, and the numbers, lots of numbers of what money went to whom and when. And we're going to start, though, right here, right now, the recent election cycle. So first off, again, thanks for being here. And what trends in this current campaign landscape did you find? What stood out to you the most?
So according to my good friends over at Open Secrets, this was the most expensive election in American history. That follows a trend. Usually the presidential election is more expensive than the previous presidential election, and we broke that record again. Another thing that was remarkable about the 2024 election was the number of outside spenders. So it clocked in around $4.4 billion. And another notable thing is that one of every four outside dollars was dark. So there was over $1 billion in dark money in the 2024 election.
That's amazing, and it's unfortunate in a sense that it's not uncommon that it gets more and more money after every presidential election.
Yeah, exactly. The only time where this trend was broken was in the 2016 election. That was the Trump-Clinton election, and he didn't raise much money for a presidential candidate. Clinton actually outraised him, but still lost the election. And we saw that pattern repeat in the 2024 race. Harris outraised Trump again, but did not win the election.
Those are interesting thoughts when people think that you have to have so much money to win an election. And as I said early on in the introduction, that I've been on both sides of this, and sometimes people will look at you and say, "Well, you're not a good enough candidate because you can't raise money." So, in a sense, it's kind of good that you can still win without having raised the most money. I mean, but we're talking millions and billions of dollars, like you just said.
Yeah. So you don't always win just because you have the most money in American politics, but you often win when you have the most money in politics. Uh,
Good point.
yeah.
Good point.
Especially in Congress, often it's the incumbents who have more money than their challengers, and uh, the person with the most money running in Congress is often the victor.
Right, especially with that incumbency behind it too. And I do have to apologize for my dog that you might hear in the background. He doesn't like money in politics either, but I think it's the dogs outside. But let's get down to the basic first too, because when we talk dark money, it sounds so secretive and almost illegal in a sense, but maybe it isn't. And this is why you have to explain it from the get-go here.
Sure. What I mean by dark money is money that's spent in an American election where the public does not know the true source. Now, the recipe for making dark money is you have either a corporation or sometimes a billionaire who doesn't want to spend under their real names. And so they legally launder it through an opaque nonprofit, often a 501c4, which is a social welfare organization, or a 501c6, which is a trade association. And once that money goes through that opaque nonprofit, the public can see that a C4 or a C6 is spending in politics. What they can't see is the true source of the money. And that's what I mean by dark money. And people have different definitions of dark money. So, for example, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse talks a lot about dark money, but he means it in a slightly different way than I do. He talks about dark money that surrounds the US Supreme Court. That doesn't fall under my definition because we don't elect our Supreme Court justices. So when I'm talking dark money, I'm talking about money that is spent to elect a candidate where the public just cannot tell who the source of the funds is.
I love your definition of that. And what I think is interesting too, because I think this happens on a state level too. I can speak for West Virginia. It's about the transparency. And a couple years ago, there was a movement to increase the contribution level from like $1,000 to 2,800 per election. And it's like, well, you're not solving anything. You're not taking money out of politics. You're only putting more in. And their reasoning for doing that was, oh, well, you have to be more transparent. You have to report it more. But my problem with that is somebody sees a commercial on TV. Let's say they're a soccer mom. They're getting ready to run their kids out. They see this nasty commercial that comes on TV. They're ready to run out the door to practice. They're not getting on a website to find out, oh, who gave that money. I mean, that's really is a concern that I have. So how can we find out about these people? Who are some of them? And what do we know about them when they're giving to groups instead of a candidate?
So in the area of dark money, unfortunately, you need either litigation or a leak in order to get at the sources of dark money. So with litigation, you get some discovery of something that someone was trying to hide. And then with a leak, you have a whistleblower who has secret information and they are willing to give that information to the press. But if you don't have litigation or a leak, dark money remains dark. And I should be clear that most dark money is actually legal. It's created by the way that our campaign finance systems and our tax systems interact. So our tax systems, when you're giving to a charity, the presumption is that that will remain secret. The presumption in most of campaign finance is that we have transparency of money in politics. and this has been endorsed by the Supreme Court in case after case. They speak of the voter informational interest that's served by disclosing money in politics. So the Supreme Court, even in Citizens United, is pro-disclosure. But because of this strange interaction between our tax code and our campaign finance code, once you put one of those opaque nonprofits in the middle of your funding stream, it becomes almost impossible for the average voter or a member of the public to discover the true sources of this money, unless someone fesses up.
Maybe that's where the average person can help out too. I mean, do we, the regular public, know about an example of this where we have seen it? I mean, it's in your book. I mean, you give several examples. You want to point one of those out?
Sure. One of my favorite recent examples of revealing dark money involves Sam Bankman-Fried. So Sam Bankman-Fried was this wunderkind. He was a billionaire before he was age 30, and he ran a cryptocurrency exchange called FTX, and then a sister firm called Alameda, which was a cryptocurrency hedge fund. Now, the litigation in Sam Bankman-Fried's case is that he is prosecuted. So DOJ prosecutes him for securities fraud. They also prosecute him for campaign finance crimes. They accuse Sam Bankman-Fried of making $100 million in illegal corporate campaign contributions. And this is a violation of a very old law called the Tillman Act from 1907. And he ends up going to prison for the securities fraud. He doesn't actually go get tried for the campaign finance crimes for a really specific reason. He had been hiding out in the Bahamas, and so they had to extradite him from the Bahamas to the United States in order for him to stand trial. And his extradition papers didn't mention campaign finance crimes. So his very good criminal defense lawyers were able to argue that it would be unjust to prosecute him for campaign finance crimes because he hadn't been extradited for them. The other thing that we have in Sam Bankman-Fried's case is a leak. So the leak in Sam Bankman-Fried's case is Sam Bankman-Fried. So while he is under indictment, he starts talking to the press. And the press can tell from campaign finance filings that he has spent around $38 million in the 2022 midterm. And what he says to the press while he is under indictment is, I gave all of my money to Democrats on the record, and then I gave to Republicans dark. And so it's that dark money that triggers a count against him. But as I said before, he actually doesn't end up getting tried for his campaign finance crimes, which could have added even more than the 25 years that he got for his securities crimes. And even that, I think, will probably be appealed. We'll see if Mr. Bankman-Fried starts asking for a pardon, because these are federal prosecutions.
Oh, and there's another little element to this story too that we can look forward to also, I think. And that's just one of the stories that you had. And I just want to read a little piece that, because it does impact, like, we're like, oh, you know, I'm the regular person. You're not the regular person. So I'm sitting here representing the regular person. So we regular people are like, oh, another rich guy goes to jail for something. But it does impact us. It does hurt us because of that influence that they have that my $25 donors might not have, right?
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead.
So one of the things that I also talk about, which is an ongoing problem, is the first energy scandal out of Ohio. So this involves a energy company called First Energy, and they want a bailout from the taxpayers of Ohio of their nuclear facilities. And this is going to cost the taxpayers of Ohio, upwards of $1 billion. And so what executives at this company decide to do is bribe members of the Ohio legislature, including the Speaker of the House in Ohio. His name is Larry Householder. And one of the things that you can see in his trial is they have transcripts of wiretaps that they put on Householder and his top staff. And one of the things that drives me a little bonkers is you can hear on these wiretaps that they think, these politicians, these leaders of the legislature in Ohio, they think that the dark money is blessed by Citizens United. And one of the ways that they use $60 million in bribes from this energy company into these politicians' pockets is they use it to create dark money ads in Ohio, and that is used to elect more people who will support Householder, especially in his bid to be the Speaker of the House. So it goes really deep with Ohio politics. And one of the reasons why I say this is still an unfolding story is even as I was turning in the manuscript for this book, the prosecutors in Ohio were still finding new people to prosecute in this scandal. So that is one of these stories that is ongoing and that I think people should keep an eye on, because it really is going to impact the ratepayers in Ohio, how much energy costs and how much are they subsidizing how energy costs in their state.
Right. And we don't have First Energy in West Virginia, but there was some legislative money that might have gone to them during a special legislative session. So yes, and it seems as though like you could immediately write edition 2 of this book like that, because there's so much that has changed in this. But I do want to go back to this. It's on page 95, and it just talks about like you're able to tell us about these things, these situations. Friedman and Householder, but after the fact. And you write in here that dark money thwarted transparency of money in politics during American elections when the information would have been useful to voters. Prosecutors took years to unravel these schemes, whichever one we're going to mention. And by the time the perpetrators were arrested, tried, and convicted, the elections they meddled in were long since over. And so that's just that's where we're also hurt as voters and citizens of this country. It's like, yeah, you got the bad guy, but after someone has cast their vote. And that's just a shame. That's the unfairness that eats at me.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, one of the reasons why the Supreme Court wants there to be transparency of money in politics is they want transparency in real time. And they want it in time to inform voters so that a voter knows who is trying to influence their vote. But because dark money thwarts that transparency, that's why an author like myself has to wait for that litigation or a leak. And when it's litigation, it can take it's seemingly forever. I mean, one of the other stories that I have in this book is about Obama's reelection campaign in 2012. And this story is wild. So it starts with a birthday party in Las Vegas that is thrown by a Malaysian billionaire named Joe Low. So he throws his own birthday party. Apparently, he didn't have friends to throw him this party. He throws it for himself. And one of the things that happens at this birthday party is Britney Spears jumps out of his birthday cake and sings him happy birthday. And there are lots of celebrities at this party. And a few weeks later, the 2012 election happens. Now, in that interregnum, he also decides to give a rapper from the Fugees, which was a rap group. His name is Pras Michel. He goes by the rap name Pras. So Joe Low gives Pras $20 million. And the reason that he gives him this money is Joe Low, the Malaysian businessman, wants a photograph of himself with the sitting president, which at the time was Barack Obama. So then there's this circuitous way that this money makes its way into American politics. So it starts with shell companies that Joe Low controls. It goes to shell companies that Pras Michel controls. At some point, Pras has the money in his hands. He gives it to friends of his who act as straw donors, and then the money ends up supporting the Obama re-election campaign. And one of the things about this is this shows that this is a bipartisan problem. No single political party has a monopoly on corruption. It is a problem on both sides. But anyway, the reason that Joe Low had all of this money, the money to give $1 million to Britney Spears to jump out of his birthday cake, the ability to give Pras Michel $20 million for a photo op, was that Joe Low stands accused of being one of the largest criminals of all time. So he stands accused of stealing between $4 and $5 billion from a Malaysian sovereign wealth fund. And then he comes to the United States and tries to influence our politics just because he wants a picture of himself with the sitting president of the United States. Oh, and spoiler alert, he gets the picture of himself with the sitting president after the election. So I think this is a case where it just smells to high heaven. And bonus, Joe Low has never been caught, so he's never faced justice for this. Pras Michel is facing potentially decades for his role in this scandal.
That was an amazing story that that's in the book, and that folks should really really get a hold of and learn so much about this background, because especially, just as you said, this Joe Low, spelled J-H-O, last name L-O-W, has not been caught. And before, you have it in the book, but I wanted to see an update on where he might be. And the latest was they think he might be in China or something, walking around, and I think the people of Malaysia are still looking for him also. But in part of that story, let me just finish up a little bit more of page 95, and we'll continue to ask some questions. As long as U.S. elections are privately funded, they run the risk of becoming playthings of unscrupulous foreign kleptocrats. I think I wanted to say that word, who know they can hide their identities behind corporate structures to spend millions in dark money in American elections. Like that's just the pure example. And it becomes sickening and unfair again. I mean, they throw $20 million around like it's $20 to you and me. And I mean, and that's what that's what always angers me truly about all this big money in politics. That someone can have so much wealth. And I have a consistent woman named Lucille who would always write a $25 check for me. And it's like, she for me, she has the same influence, but for others, that's not the case. So thank you for bringing some of that out. Now let's ask one of these questions as we're getting in. The audience are being good students to you, Professor Ciara. Can you clarify what the Supreme Court stance is on dark money, since we're continuing on that for a bit?
Sure. So the Supreme Court has entertained challenges to disclosure of money in politics in several different cases. It was in Buckley versus Vallejo. So Buckley versus Vallejo, I think, has earned the unfortunate reputation as being the case that decided that money was speech. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that, but that's one of the ways that people think about that case. I think it is 100 pages long, so I understand why everyone has not memorized Buckley to the extent that perhaps I have. But one of the things that the Supreme Court does in Buckley versus Valeo is it upholds the transparency from the Federal Election Campaign Act, otherwise known as FECA. FECA 74 was a reform that was enacted by Congress as a reaction to the Watergate scandal. The Watergate scandal had all sorts of crimes. I think of it as a welter of crimes, including the break-in at the Watergate. But what I think is less known today is that the break-in at the Watergate was funded by illegal corporate campaign contributions to the committee to reelect the president. So it went into Nixon's reelection campaign, which had the awesome acronym CREEP. So that illegal corporate money in CREEP actually funded the illegal break-in at the DNC's offices at the Watergate building, hence the name of the scandal. So when the Supreme Court in Buckley is looking at the reforms that are part of FECA, one of the things that is challenged is the disclosure requirements. And the Supreme Court says those disclosure requirements are perfectly constitutional. And then they have three different justifications. One is the voter informational interest I mentioned earlier. So voters need to be informed. Another is an anti-corruption interest. There is this belief going back to Justice Brandeis that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And then finally, there is a interest in making sure that other parts of campaign finance law are followed. This is the anti-circumvention interest. So if we're going to have contribution limits, which we do have, in Buckley's day, it was $1,000 per person. Well, you can't enforce that $1,000 limit unless you have transparency where people tell you, I've already spent $1,000 in politics, and thus I'm not eligible to spend any more money. So all of those reasons were given in Buckley, and those have been upheld, including in Citizens United. They return to the voter informational interest and they uphold the disclosure of money in politics. And then in a later case called McCutcheon, they reaffirm that they uphold the disclosure of money in politics. So the Supreme Court right now is pro-disclosure. And that drives me a little bonkers too, because lots of people just misinterpret what the Supreme Court has said because of how big political actors act. So people who spend a lot of money in politics know that they have a really weak regulator in the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, and they sort of make this bet that the FEC won't stop them if they do something obnoxious. And usually they are right. Though in the area of campaign finance, the FEC and the DOJ have overlapping jurisdiction to enforce campaign finance law. But because the FEC almost never enforces campaign finance law, you could be prosecuted by DOJ for something that the FEC would not even fine you for. So it is a very sort of broken system.
So with that, I mean, what are some of the things that we can do to fix that? You know, there's a lot, too much money in politics. Well, what would you do about it? Well, we would overturn Citizens United. That's not really that easy, is it? And it's only one piece of the puzzle, as you just adequately explained. So what can folks do? And maybe in a little bit we'll get to the best part that I love about your book too. I love action items, and folks will know we're on these Brennan Center Lives. I always like to leave people with an action item, and you certainly do with the needed reforms that you offer up. So what can someone do as they're here listening right now when we talk about what's going on with the Supreme Court, the FEC, the DOJ?
Sure. So there are a lots of things that the average person can do. I work on corporate money and politics. And so you could either fix this through corporate law or you could fix this through election law. And you have actions that you can do as a voter and a consumer and an investor. So if you're going to fix this through corporate law, then I am a huge fan of the UK Companies Act. So our friends across the pond, they have a requirement that companies get shareholder approval of corporate political spending before it happens. And if a particular company can't convince its investors to approve their political spending, they can't do it. We don't have that in the United States, and I think that would be a huge improvement. You could also try to fix this through the election law. And you could change what rules are at the FEC, and that would help at the federal level. But I think over the next 4 years, most of the action is likely to be in the states and at the local level. And you can tell your state reps, your city council, that you want reform of money in politics, because money isn't just spent in federal elections, it's spent in state and local elections too. And so you want to make sure that there is at least transparency of the money that's going into local politics and state politics. And write your representative and tell them that you care about this. That is one clear action item.
A few follow-up questions to that. An audience member is asking, and you mentioned this, what can you name any specific change? Well, and it's the next 4 years for the FEC, maybe put more teeth into it, but what changes could be made to the FEC to improve enforcement of existing campaign laws?
So the FEC was designed to fail and fails. And what I mean by it was designed to fail is it's one of the two entities at the federal level that has an even number of commissioners. The other one is the Election Assistance Commission. So the two commissions that are supposed to deal with democracy have this very flawed structure. So at the FEC, you have 3 Republican commissioners and 3 Democratic commissioners. And you need 4 commissioners to do almost anything at the commission. And so they often deadlock and do nothing, even if what the question that is before them is, should we enforce this longstanding campaign finance law? The answer is often 3-3, which is a deadlock, which means it's not enforced. So you could have reform of the structure of the FEC such that it was a odd number of commissioners instead of an even number of commissioners. And thus you would get a clear majority. And it would probably toggle back and forth depending who was in charge of the government. But that is true of every other federal agency. I mean, one of the things that I like about the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is another federal agency, is that they have an odd number of commissioners, which means that they get clear majorities and they can do things and enforce laws. The FEC is just sort of fatally flawed in this way, and eventually it needs to be reformed.
Well, yeah, and I do believe, and maybe you can help me, but the Freedom to Vote Act, there was a long list of reforms to be made in the Freedom to Vote Act, which was so close, except for almost a former senator from West Virginia. I got a lot of ties here when we're coming from West Virginia, but that's what it was. As simple as that was one of the lines was make it an uneven number in the FEC. And so, you're right. We don't know what will take place in the next 4 years. Let me get to the other follow-up about what you said when we were talking, you said the action needs to be taken in the state and local levels. And we are seeing a growing number of state and local governments adopting public finance programs. So that's one outlet that someone that an average person, we'll just start calling them individuals, could could take? And why do you think that some of these public financing reforms are gaining traction?
So you're right. Public financing is a great alternative to a fully privately financed campaign finance system, which is what most candidates have to suffer through. A privately financed campaign finance system means that either the candidate themselves has to be independently wealthy and then they can self finance, or they need a wealthy network of donors that they can shake down for money. And if you don't have that wealthy network of donors, often that dissuades really good people from running for office. I mean, there are many obstacles to running for office, whether it's, do I have to quit my job to campaign? Uh, can I afford childcare if my events are at night? But one of the biggest ones is, do I have a network where I can raise enough money to be considered a serious candidate? I mean, in some ways, I think journalists need to be better at not falling for the money primary. So, what I mean by the money primary is often when journalists who cover politics are trying to convey to their readers, like, is this a serious candidate? Is this not a serious candidate? One of the worst proxies that they can choose is how much money they have raised. But often that's a discoverable fact because we do have campaign finance laws still. And they will lead with that. And I think that can be deeply misleading, because just because someone can't raise a lot of money does not mean that they aren't, highly educated, highly motivated, would be a great member of a legislature or a mayor. But because of this weird bias in the way things are covered in the press, often the money is seen as a proxy for talent. And I think that is disastrous. So when you have public financing, you give a respite from the demands of a privately financed campaign finance system. And you can incentivize different types of behavior. So the incentive in a privately financed election is to have the richest donors backing you, especially post Citizens United, where they can spend an unlimited amount of money independent of you, but supporting your candidacy. So I think we saw in the 2024 election the role of the richest man in the world. He decided to spend really big. He spent it mostly independent. But because of Citizens United, there's no way to hem that in. But if you have individuals who have the option of getting public financing, so for example, there's a really good long-standing public financing system in New York City, and that incentivizes the publicly financed candidates to raise small dollar donations from where they live, from their constituency. And that gives you more access as a small donor to the person who might end up representing you. If you have just a privately financed system, what you get is our members of Congress spending half of their waking hours dialing for dollars. And they're not dialing small donors, they're dialing the biggest donors that they can find. And that means who they're talking to and interacting with are those large donors. So a while ago, I wrote a law review article called Time Suck. And that was a quote from Representative Sarbanes, because he was describing the amount of time he had to raise money as a freshman in Congress. And it really is a full-time job on top of their job of being a representative.
Yep. I mean, that's exactly what you say. I mean, they're not calling the Lucille's for their $25 contribution. And thus you're not hearing what is really taking place in your district, in your state, in your county, because you're not talking to those people who have them that you're supposed to be running to serve. So yes. All right. So many follow-ups from some of the questions and things. Because there's someone who asked, you talked about Citizens United, that always pops up because the richest man in the world who, and sometimes when I hear that, I'm like, who are we going through? Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, but no, you're talking about Elon Musk. And the question here is from an audience member is what would it take to overturn Citizens United?
Okay. So because Citizens United was decided by the Supreme Court on First Amendment grounds, that means that it can't just be undone by an act of Congress. Rather, there are two routes to getting rid of Citizens United. One is that you convince a future Supreme Court that Citizens United was wrongly decided, and they reverse themselves. And, over time, the Supreme Court has done really big reversals. So I think one of the most famous reversals is Plessy versus Ferguson, which blessed separate but equal. That gets overturned in Brown versus Board of Education. So there are these reversals, but it can take 50 years for the Supreme Court to realize its own mistakes. So that's one approach, but it's probably a long-term effort. And then the other approach is when the Supreme Court makes one of these grievous mistakes on constitutional grounds, then you have to amend the Constitution. And then you have to flip open your Constitution and look at Article 5. And the way that you amend the Constitution is really onerous, especially as we have added more and more states to the Union. So, at the beginning of the country, when there were only 13 states, it was not that hard to amend the Constitution, and it was pretty easy to add the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments. But now we have not had a constitutional amendment since the 1990s. And there's a real good reason for that. You need a supermajority of both houses of Congress, and then you need a supermajority of the states to ratify. And so nothing else has gotten through so far. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it is a really heavy lift.
Agreed on that. And you gave two alternatives, but neither might not be happening anytime soon. Let me just ask a quick question, because then I might ask this other Supreme Court. You were talking about public financing and the press and the media. And that's what I told you. They look at a candidate and say, oh, they can't raise money. And this is just kind of off the top of my head, but others have thought this with another, the FCC, with another alphabet soup, Federal Communications Commission. Would there ever be a possibility that the FCC would require free advertisement, free political ads to be run on television stations? Or that's old school now, but on the media.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different reforms that could run through a lot of different federal agencies. I would imagine that if the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, if they were giving out free airtime, the first thing that you would see is corporate lawyers in court claiming that that was an illegal taking of the property of the broadcasters. But nonetheless, it would probably be an improvement over our current system. So when you look at where money in politics goes, it definitely goes to political consultants, but it also goes to advertisers and to broadcasters, or any place that an ad can show up. So now there are millions and millions of dollars that are spent online, because what a political advertiser really wants is to get in front of you. And they know that people don't watch TV in the same way that they used to. Number one, they may not be watching TV at all. Number two, if they're watching TV, they're watching it in a way that enables the viewer to skip all the ads. So if you're an advertiser, that's a big problem. So instead, they have turned to trying to get into your Facebook feed, your Twitter feed, your TikTok feed, your Blue Sky feed. And one of the problems that presents as a campaign finance matter is the last time that the Congress decided to tackle campaign finance was in a law called BICRA, which is the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002. And when they were writing that law, they had a particular problem in mind, which was the problem of sham issue ads. So sham issue ads were these broadcast ads that mentioned a hot button topic of the day and then urged the viewer to call a particular member of Congress. It would always be the case that the person that they were telling you to call was also a candidate for office. And it was pretty clear from these sham issue ads which way the advertiser wanted you to think about this person. So, whether it was gun control or abortion or whatever hot button topic, it was, the dark, ominous color palette, the ominous music. And it was usually to trash an incumbent and try to encourage people to not vote for that person. But under part of Buckley versus Vallejo, if you didn't have the magic words, vote for, vote against, it wasn't a regulable ad. So this law from 2002 fixed that problem. And they fixed that problem by creating a new category, which are known as electioneering communications, and it regulated that. So that closed the issue ad loophole. But it created its own problem for us today, which is they put the word broadcast in this definition. And that's a problem today because a lot of political ads are not broadcast at all. They are put online entirely. But if you put an ad completely online, you thwart the campaign finance disclosure rules because it's not a broadcast ad.
Yes, and that was an old question that had been in my mind for a long time because I knew better. When I went to buy commercials, they didn't want to sell me the ones on TV. They wanted to sell me the digital ones that they were also doing. But then this brings up a question from an audience member. Is there current support in Congress for campaign finance reform?
There is. It has weirdly become a partisan issue, like many different things that didn't used to be thought of as partisan have now, I think, sadly become such. I mean, I cannot tell you how much I miss John McCain. So the law that I was just talking about, BICRA, it's also known as McCain-Feingold. And it's known that way because John McCain and Russ Feingold were the co-sponsors of that legislation. And I will point out that it passed in 2002 when Republican George W. Bush was the president and the Republicans controlled both houses of Congress. So it's not impossible just because we are facing a trifecta of Republican control in the next 2 years that the campaign finance law reform is somehow impossible. The pattern that I see in my scholarship is you have a big corporate scandal, and often the response from Congress is campaign finance reform. So you saw that in the creation of the Tillman Act. That was a reaction to insurers giving secret money to the Republican Party in 1904 to support the election of Teddy Roosevelt. Then you have Teapot Dome, which is one of those stories that I have in my book. That is a corporate bribery scandal about oil men. And after that scandal, you get a law called the Corrupt Practices Act, which is one of the first campaign finance laws in the country. And then after Watergate, which is another corporate scandal, you have illegal corporate money going into CREEP, which is Nixon's reelection campaign. That results in FICA. And then the implosion of Enron, which at the time was the biggest corporate bankruptcy ever, and it was a huge accounting fraud scandal. That leads to the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, otherwise known as McCain-Feingold. So I always feel like we're always just one ridiculous scandal away from getting real campaign finance reform at the federal level.
You know what I thought might be interesting as you go through that timeline, and you mentioned this in the book when it comes to after the January 6th, or maybe not not the action of those who went into the Capitol, the insurrection on January 6th, but the action of those congressional members who voted or didn't vote for the approval of the Electoral College. And there were a lot of corporations that at the time then just said that they wouldn't be giving money, but then it later on continued in the committee, the Sedition Committee, those members. But they came back and continued to provide funding, campaign finance money. And I think you said that John Cornyn was the one who got the most of that money. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So one of the things I looked at in Corporatocracy is was there any corporate funding that supported the insurrection? And I look at an entity called the Rule of Law Defense Fund, which is an offshoot of the Republican Attorneys General Association, better known as RAGA. And one of the reasons why I look at RAGA is over 50% of its funding is corporate. And so I trace all the corporate money that came into RAGA before the insurrection. And then I also look at the money that kept on flowing after the insurrection. And there was this moment for a couple of weeks after January 6th where corporations came out, sometimes sua sponte, and said, we're not going to give to those individuals who wouldn't vote to affirm the Biden Electoral College votes. And even though it was hundreds of corporations who made that pledge, if you look 4 years later, almost all of them broke their promise. And so even though they bothered to promise that they would get out of this game of giving corporate PAC money to these individuals, when you look at where the corporate PAC money is flowing, the spigot is back on.
We have about 8 minutes left, and there's 2 questions that I'm going to ask. The first one, and if you can, it's a fascinating story in the book, and I think it's one of the worst story about money in politics that you've ever heard. And if you can make it in about, I don't know, 3 minutes, and then I'll ask you the final question.
Yeah,
and I think that you're going to talk about
all right,
with the connection of the business bailout of the Nazi Party.
Yeah. So I'm often asked what the worst money in politics story I've ever heard is, and it is briefly corporations bailing out the Nazis in Germany in 1933. If you look at the start of that year, the Nazi Party was completely broke. So they have a secret meeting between titans of industry and leaders of the Nazi Party. Hitler himself tells these businessmen that private enterprise and democracy are incompatible. And these businessmen hear this anti-democratic screed, and they fork over millions in dark money. And at the time, the average German had no idea that this money was going from these companies to this political party. And that's the problem with dark money. You don't know as an outsider what's going on, and only the insiders know what is happening.
Okay, I'm going to ask a little follow-up to that too, because what I thought was fascinating that we maybe as Americans, or maybe lacking on my history, but Henry Ford was a part of this. I don't know for sure if he was part of the bailout, but he was part of some of the influence that Hitler would read some of his newsletters that he would send out. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, Henry Ford, I don't understand how he still has a good name in American history. But one of the things that he did with his wealth is he bought his hometown paper and then had his hometown paper run anti-Semitic screed after anti-Semitic screed. Then he had these things bound into books, translated into multiple languages, decided not to copyright it on purpose so that other people could freely copy it. And that his screeds make their way over to Germany. And Hitler has a picture of Henry Ford on his desk. And Henry Ford is the only American mentioned in Mein Kampf. So there was like this love fest between these two men. They sent each other birthday gifts. It was really pretty disgusting.
Yeah, I that's, you mentioned that in the book with that Henry Ford would also put these pamphlets, booklets. If someone buys a new Model T and it's in there. So it's, I mean, you know, it's brilliant and maybe sickening. It is brilliant and sickening at the same time. We are talking with Ciara Torres-Spelliscy. This is her book, Corporatocracy, and I want to give you one last question. I had one before that though too, because we have a little bit of extra time left. But I think what we'll wrap up with. Oh no, I know what it was. It's the reforms at the back, and maybe give me just one or two when you're talking about that we haven't discussed already, because I always like to leave people with action items, something to feel good about that we can do, you have a couple pages of that in the back of your book. And so maybe mention one of them, and then I'll get to the final question.
Sure. Well, one of the things you can do is not only to use your power as a voter, but also use your power as a consumer and an investor. So if you find out that a particular corporation is backing election deniers, for example, you might think, well, is that corporation worth my giving my hard-earned dollars to? And so one of the things I would encourage you to think about is you definitely have power as a voter, and please use that as often as you can. But you also have power with your dollars, and you can decide what type of world you want to support. And you should think about, you know, as these corporations support politicians who are making it harder to vote, maybe they do not deserve financial support either.
That's good. Good advice, and a lot of information in here in the book. And thank you for joining us. And as we wrap up, just in a few sentences, I mean, that was pretty good advice that you just gave. One thing that you want our audience to walk away with that they'll be thinking about as they're heading out.
So I often, when I'm talking to groups of law students, say the following, and so I'll say it here too. I think we should learn a lesson from the suffragists. They worked on getting women the vote for over 50 years. They never gave up, and neither should we. Democracy is worth fighting for.
Excellent. I really appreciate that. What a great lasting thought to have. Thank you again, Professor, for being here. And thank you to the audience for participating and being part of the questions that we're having. And the Brennan Center looks forward to having you at more events like this. So look for Brennan Center live events, and you can do that. You can become part of the understanding and things that are taking place at the Brennan Center by going to the website and signing up for the newsletter at brennancenter.org/events, or just go straight to the homepage. And I appreciate your being part of this and tuning in. I'm Natalie Tennant, former Secretary of State of West Virginia, part-time elect county commissioner for Kanawha County in West Virginia. And again, I thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.